With the regular season starting tonight, it's a great time to do a fun exercise, as always, in tiering teams. So, with that said, I am going to pay a lot more focus to what the playoffs will look like, but there is going to be attention paid as well to what the teams will look like in the regular season. And one of the teams that I think projects as a little bit of a better playoff team, believe it or not, if they can get there, is the Pelicans. I'm not sure they're going to because the West is so good, but talent wise, they are definitely within play in range. It's just a not so seamless fit across the board. Poole, Murray, and Zion all are going to want the ball a fair amount, and Trey Murphy and Herb Jones are great in that they don't want the ball and can still be amazing, but center is not really too much of a thing for them. Yves Missy, Derek Queen, Kevon Looney, they all are unknown, or in the case of Looney, just not that high caliber of players. So, with that said, I do think they can make the playoffs, but for the most part, I'm going to have them as just loiterers. And another team that is interesting despite not being too good is the Trailblazers. I do like their defensive identity. I think they have a lot going for them there. Drew Holiday, if he stays on the team, is amazing, of course. Klingon was really sharp there as a defensive player. Speaking of sharp, you have Shaden Sharp, who's not really a defensive player. I think overall they have a pretty good thing going for them on defense. It's not necessarily elite, but there are some things to Kamara is also amazing defensively, I should mention. But we're this far into the team analysis, and I haven't really mentioned the offense. That's kind of with reason. Scoot Henderson, you hope, can finally figure something out. Not sure about that. Denny Avdia, really solid season last year, but projects as more of like a third option probably on a good team. And Sharp, you again hope for something there, but you don't have much of a baseline. So, with that said, I think they're another team that, if all things go right, could be competing for a play in spot. But the issue is, this is again the West. So, I'm going to put them in as loiterers and debating. I think I like them a little less than the Pelicans just because I do think the Pelicans have a little bit higher end of talent, but it is hard to go wrong with Portland having such a good baseline with their defense. The Thunder, we finally get to a real team here, and it's, spoiler alert, the best team in the league. I don't think that really is breaking news. So they're, of course, going into the finals or bust. They are so good. And with the league and the West in particular being so good, it's, really dangerous to say you kind of expect a championship. It's not to that level where it's, a guarantee by any stretch, but it is to the point where if the Thunder don't win the finals, it feels like a bit of a disappointment, which is so crazy to say, but it's deserved. You look up and down the roster, there's no deficiencies to be found. Amazing defense all around. You have about as good of a scorer in SGA as there is. You have great size with Holmgren and Hartenstein. You have Jalen Williams, one of the best number twos. I'm not really breaking news here by saying this team is amazing, and they easily go in the finals or bust category. Another team that is really legit in the West, again, is the Rockets, who I think for me are right on the teetering of dark horse or top tier, which seems a little bit offensive to say that they're not just top tier because they were, I believe, the second seed in the West last year, and they had Durant, really only, losing Fred Van Vliet, which sucks. But I do think They're just not quite there offensively to where you feel comfortable with putting them as a bona fide finals or bust team. You definitely want to be at that level because Durant is such a great superstar and there's such great defense. Amen Thompson, about as good as it gets as a defender. You have a lot of depth with big guys, Şengün, Steven Adams, Clint Capella. That's a lot to like there. Durant, of course, also huge. Jabari Smith. There's a lot to like here. There's great defense all around, but Şengün quite right now isn't efficient enough, honestly. And that I think gets understated a lot because people are intrigued with what he can be, but with Durant, you kind of have to focus more on what is currently the situation because you don't have too much of a timeline with him as he's so up there in an age. So I think Şengün can really take a step forward and get his efficiency up now that Durant's going to be far and away the main guy offensively. But with that said, I do still have some lingering concerns for them. So I'm going to put them in the finals or bust, but I think there are going to be quite a few teams that we put in that same caliber with them or potentially higher. And honestly, one of them comes up immediately with the Lakers. They definitely don't have the level of refinement that the Rockets do, but I do really like what they have in the high end stuff, of course, with Luca and LeBron. There is a little bit of course, the questionable fit with both guys tending to have the ball a lot. In Luca's case, pretty much every single time he's going to have the ball. And there's some issues with the defense, I think. Sometimes I feel like it goes understated. Sometimes it might go overstated with people thinking it's just going to be terrible. I don't think it's going to be terrible, but I don't think it's going to be in the conventional championship caliber. It could be what the Nuggets were when they won the championship and they were like average, but that is such a rare occurrence that you don't feel great about that. Marcus Smart, really not athletic and a bit overstated as a defender historically. When he won his deploy, it was kind of a, you know, celebration of his career more so than it was for him that year. So it was a bit fraudulent, but you know, Smart can guard, I think, oddly enough, despite him being the point guard, I think he can guard forwards pretty well. But aside from that, Vanderbilt can guard, but is just so not there as an offensive player. I do think, Luca and LeBron can hang with anybody's duo. Aiton, I think, is a solid center. I think Luca's going to get the most out of him for sure. But I'm going to put them behind Houston. I do think Houston is in a weird spot with that Van Fleet injury because it does really take away a lot of the playmaking that was already a little bit limited. They're going to rely so much more now on Amen Thompson and, you know, Reed Shepard, who just was not proficient at all really last year to be their guys. I do think though the Lakers are in that caliber where you feel like it's actually no, I can't bring it. I'm gonna put them as a dark horse. I do think, again that the high end is there, but just their baseline is not quite good enough. Hachimura, really solid forward to have. I think a lot of teams would want him, even if they're at like the highest caliber of team. Reeves, very legit number three, but I just don't see with this defensive identity they have being, you know, some solid guys and then some really iffy ones. I don't see them as a real contending team, but maybe they make a move come deadline time that gets them there. Certainly possible. Denver, pretty much no reason to beat around the bush. I'm putting them right behind the Thunder. I think, not necessarily right behind as in they're right there with them, but they're easily the second best team here, no doubt about it for me. Houston, great situation, of course. Denver, though, my goodness, it is very scary to think what they can be this upcoming season because they were already really putting in the, fear against the Thunder this previous season, taking them to 7. I know it didn't end up, in their going their favor, but to get 7 against the Thunder with Michael Porter Jr., kind of a weird situation for Denver in that their third guy isn't too much different than, like their fourth, fifth, even. But, Michael Porter Jr., somewhere in that mix for them last year, and, just so crippled with injury, unfortunately. But, they get a great, I think, upgrade, honestly, across the board for the most part with Cam Johnson. I do like him a lot more as a defender. Michael Porter Jr. is just not good there, and Cam is pretty legit, honestly, defensively. I think sometimes a little bit underrated because he wasn't putting in his best effort for sure with Brooklyn, but I think that's probably just one, Brooklyn is terrible, and two, it's hard to be committed when you're on a terrible team like that. So I don't really have too much fear there. I love Brown as another guy you can throw on good players. I love Gordon in that sense as well. Jamal Murray, I think, oftentimes a little bit overrated. I do think, playing with Jokic in that two-man action gets you looking a lot better than you are because so much focus is going on Jokic, but Murray can certainly win you games come playoff time. I do think the additions of the Valanciunas and honestly even Bruce Brown to an extent, but mainly Valanciunas for me. Tim Hardaway maybe, but the big thing, and Deron Holmes as well actually, they have someone to give Jokic a little bit of breather. That has not been the case in so long. And Valanciunas, I think, honestly, pretty solid, legit, starting caliber center. Not a high end starting caliber center, but a starting one nonetheless in my eyes. And, to have him as your bench guy that you go to when Jokic needs a little bit of a break, that's going to be huge in the regular season to make Jokic a bit more, you know, limited in minutes. And that's going to be so good in the playoffs too, because you're not going to have, you know, Jokic playing every single minute or losing like 10 points of a lead or what have you in the 5 minutes that Jokic would be resting. So I love Valanciunas to them. I wish they could have gotten a little bit of a difference for the center replacement, and that maybe they would be a little bit stronger defensively. Holmes, I think, can do that a bit more for sure, but Valanciunas, I think, is definitely the lead guy. At least, though, you don't really have to fundamentally change stuff up too much. Valanciunas is just, you know, much worse version of Jokic, but can, hit open guys a bit. You're not going to run the action through him by any stretch, but, play around the post at a high level, get you lots of rebounds, play solid enough defense, not, atrocious, but certainly not a plus there. So that's a lot of time on the Nuggets, but I think they deserve it. They are so excellent and, might be more than just the second best team in the West. They might just be the second best team in the league. Another great team here, though, is the Clippers, oldest team in history, probably, oldest group of guys you'll ever see doing anything athletic, even including the YMCA individuals. But with that said, there's a lot of talent there. And, these guys, very hungry. In the case of everybody but Leonard, to my knowledge, Lopez too, I guess. But, um, you know, no championships. So that is something that I think will provide them a little bit of a boost as well. Oddly enough, is that, they do realize this is kind of their last shot in lots of instances. So I do think they're going to get the most of them. And, having such amazing depth where you do really have, their bench unit could, this isn't saying the most, but it's saying a little bit still. Their bench unit could go, I think, right there with like the Brooklyns of the world. Another shot at Brooklyn, but it's kind of deserved. Brooklyn does suck. So, having a bench like that is incredible. Leaves lots of options for Ty Lue to, figure what he wants matchup wise. You can do some interesting stuff where, Harden gets rest, but you have Paul still running the action at a high level, or, switch things up even and have Beal or Leonard be more of the ball handler and go more defensive minded. So I love what they can do as far as that's concerned. I I I put them right there as a dark horse. I think I put them behind the Lakers because right now I do think the Clippers have a better situation, much better for the regular season too with the depth. But I think the Lakers have the potential to get in more of a legit stance come playoff time if they can make a move for somebody to fill out the roster more aptly. I think, they're just going to really need a forward that can defend, not even really too much focus on shooting because I think the offense is going to be just fine. But this is really close. You could definitely put the Clippers ahead of the Lakers because, again, I do think they have the better team right now. But, even factoring in with LeBron being healthy, that is. So that's a very tight one for me. And another, amazing, just all the good teams are in the West seemingly. Another good one, Minnesota. They are very worrying to me in the sense that I don't have the greatest vibes on the direction they're heading, but I want to, focus on this year alone. Edwards can go one on one with anybody in the league. Randall, when he gets going, is a premier number two. The issue is, not the soundest for a third guy, kind of a third star by committee, with McDaniels being a solid offensive guy, not an amazing one, but in the making of a third option. You also have Naz Reid, future mayor of Minnesota, of course, but it just doesn't feel fleshed out entirely, their roster. You're really relying on Dillingham for some, development early on into the process. Terrence Shannon Jr., I know a lot of people are high on him. I thought, you know, very solid prospect, but hard to rely on a guy, in year two to be a real contributing guy on a championship level team. So they're going to be another one that I put in the dark horse category. I put them ahead of the Lakers. I feel pretty soundly about that. I do think they're, a move away potentially. I don't know what the move would be because finding a legit point guard that can play, within their kind of structure where they do have a great defense, but somebody that can also, keep the spacing a bit because you don't want to have two non-shooters with Gobert and, McDaniels can be a little bit iffy. He needs all of his stuff set up for him. So finding a guy that can get the offense initiated, Conley, I just don't think is at that level, unfortunately, anymore. Conley and his, prime would be just exactly what they need because he could do everything. But, you know, Edwards, I love as, a superstar, build your team around him guy. I just think, he's going to have to do a lot again. And AVC, one of the best YouTubers out there, in my opinion, he does continually mention, I think correctly, that Edwards has to work the hardest for out of anybody for his baskets. And that I think is just unfortunately going to have to be the case again this season. So they have, I think, the business of being in the finals or bust, but that point guard situation is just not where it needs to be. Finally, we cool off a bit, in my opinion, with the Warriors, who I'm sorry, I think they just are getting a lot of love for what they've shown to be in the past several years. Not even really the past recent couple though, but people are still saying, Curry's been championship number 1 for, so long. He's been that caliber. Butler, taking lesser Miami teams, not having a Curry as a lead guy. And, Butler, I do think in his prime, honestly, should be the number 2, but he's not really in his prime anymore. Really, I think living on reputation a little bit, I do think he limits your offense quite a bit by not being able to space and being a bit ball dominant for someone that is, you know, consistent like 20 points, but not much more than that at an efficient level. So that being said, you have Butler, you have Pojemski as, kind of the smaller guard rotation. They do have Kaminga at the moment. I don't love that. I don't think he fits in at all. So, you know, there's some stuff to like, of course, but for me, they're they're probably in the make playoffs, get tons of break area. I want to say that, people aren't totally off base and that they could be a dark horse because I do think, you know, even betting odds wise, Golden State's really high up there. I think they're like a top 10 bet for finals champs. And, doing that again in the West, we already have a really good, amount of teams up there. And that's just the West so far, part of the West even. So, to be up there is really, you know, theoretically a lot, but I do think people are, potentially just buying the name brand recognition over what is actually the, current situation with them. So I don't see them as really having a chance this year. Maybe they do make some sort of move with Kaminga and, some other stuff to get in that mix, but right now I don't think they really are in the contending realm. Another team though that definitely is not in the contending realm is Memphis, and you know, they they seem like a regular season team, and they're not even too good of that, to be honest. You have, John Morant, who I think can skate by a little bit in the regular season, being super inefficient and, not supplying any defensive value at all. Get you some highlight plays and, the off chances that he's dunking, which, is pretty much the only thing he's brought to the table historically. But, you know, there are times where he wants to not do that. He lied about saying he's not, going to dunk this year, meaning last year, and he did, but he wasn't doing it frequently. So that mixed with Jaren Jackson being their best player, no doubt about it in my eyes. But JJJ is really limited as a player, can't play make at all, can't rebound. Premier defender for sure up in that upper echelon, can space the court a bit, but he needs a center out there as, he just can't rebound basically at all. Jalen Wells, pretty exciting. KCP, I do think is, still a very solid role player, but, not necessarily someone that should be a real core member of the team, which I do think he will be until, maybe they get a trade for him when they inevitably don't do too well this season. So Memphis, I think I think we put them in as a high, no, not even that high of a loiterer, honestly. I think they could honestly be behind Portland by the time it's all said and done. So Dallas, this is a very fun one. This is kind of like a Rorschach test of sorts. Do you think they get the high end play and be, legit title team? Or do you think this team that has all of the makings of just falling off the rails and not being what their talent would suggest they could be, you know, that's a very hard one to evaluate because it could go so many different ways. Clay Thompson, about 57 years old these days. Cooper Flagg, complete opposite, very young, should just be entering college this season. So, you know, you have the old and the young right there. D'Angelo Russell, who can't play two good games in like a week's succession. So, you know, lots of volatility there. Kyrie, does he come back, and play at a really high level early on? I very much doubt that, but it is something you have to account for. Davis, I hate to say the injury thing because I do think lots of times that can be overblown, but, you know, he does have a real history, as unfortunate as this is to say. But there is that amazing size that is very, alluring. I do think, you know, maybe crazy to some people, but I do think they're better than Golden State as, you know, a team that you want to hitch your wagon to. Neither are ones that I'm confident could really make some noise come playoff time, but Dallas, there is that angle where, Kyrie is at a really solid level early on following his recovery, and Davis forms a great two-man game with him. You have Lively and Gafford as centers that are just so good to have for basically any team as like run, jump, and dunk centers, but Lively even more than just that. So, there's a lot to like. Cooper Flagg, could he be a really high end contributor as a rookie? Can Clay Thompson still contribute? I think the, get tons of breaks is mainly just can they have the health and be at a high level health wise as well early. That's more so their thing than like matchup wise, honestly. Whereas Golden State, it's like you need some breaks and that you need a good trade to get things going. Here we do get a little bit of a reprieve, get the popcorn, use the bathroom, what have you. Just sucky teams to round out the West, and then the Spurs too. So, don't be gone for too long. The Kings, just the most nonsensical team you'll ever see. No rhyme or reason at all to, what the talent is for distribution or how they even play. Westbrook can play with basically no one these days. Schroeder, better version of Westbrook, in that, neither can really shoot, not really doing anything defensively. Monk has been a good shooter in the past, wasn't good this past year. Those are your guards, just you don't need anybody to shoot, especially at a position where it's basically a guarantee that they shoot these days. DeRozan can't shoot. You know, Sabonis is a real solid contributor to this day. He is, somehow still contributing for the Kings, not on, some legit team. But, Levine also, I do really think has a lot to offer. Great shooter, terrible defensively, but can supply a lot of value just from that shooting and, can create for himself a bit. This team just no no rhyme or reason to it though. Not really any big man to speak of beyond Sabonis. So it's just, all guards, but not even really that high end of guards. And, not even guys that can shoot to any level. So I'm going to put them in as loiterers. The question just is what, level of loitering are they doing? I'm going to put them definitely behind the Pelicans, but I think I can put them ahead of Memphis. I do, wonder about these teams, what's going to be traded and whatnot. That's going to mess with stuff. Phoenix, they have a little bit of something going on. You obviously still have Booker, which is a really good foundational piece. Not necessarily what you want as like a championship contending number one. I think he's like right on the lowest level of what you could get by there with, needing like everything else to be perfect around him to really compete. Grayson Allen, I think much better honestly than Jalen Green. Jalen Green has not developed one single bit aside from I guess being like, an atrocious, unbelievably bad defender to just really bad now. But, Grayson Allen can shoot a little bit at least and doesn't need the ball like Jalen Green, so Booker can cook a little bit more that way. Brooks, solid guy, honestly. They have, the Charlotte Hornets center rotation, and they drafted uh Malawach, I believe, was it? And, you know, that's something at least. So, you know, it's not going to be just like far and away the worst in the league like it was probably for, last year. It's just going to be really bad. So, with that said, they're also going in to the loitering part. I just I put them behind the Pelicans. I don't know, maybe I'm a little bit too high on these Pelicans, but I do think there's something to be intrigued by there. And, these other teams, they don't really have anything that excites me, honestly. So, or, not enough of things that excite me to negate really abysmal things elsewhere. We do have something finally, though, to, feel good about. Once again, these Spurs, Wemby, the highest ceiling potentially in the league, maybe the highest potential ever when he's at his peak. And, that is going to take you really far. But, they have some stuff in addition to that as well. Fox, I don't think is the greatest. I don't think he's the best fit for with Wemby. Throwback to when I got into a little bit of an argument with someone over on Twitter, I think it was. Still calling it Twitter because I'm cool like that. Um, Over Fox versus Morant. And, last season definitely went to Fox. So, I'm definitely right as a result of that. That's all you need to know. With that said, Fox, Castle, Harper, very intriguing lead ball handler situation. I don't think it fits together the nicest, but there is a lot of talent there. I think this is a great, team to bet on to win a championship in the next several years. As far as this year, I don't feel too good about, you know, them contending, but I do think there is so much to look forward to with them. And, you know, they're not completely out of the mix in this season. It's just not at high enough of a level for the rest of their guys, I don't think. And, Castle still needs to develop. Harper hasn't played an NBA game yet. There's a lot of, moving parts here. Is Wemby, the certified top 5 player this season? I think he's probably going to be that, but that's not a total known. So, with that said, I am going to put them in the make the playoffs, get tons of breaks. I'm going to put them ahead of Golden State. I'm going to put them behind Dallas, but I think they're right there, honestly, with Dallas. Different flavor of team for sure. And it's really hard to see the Jazz right now, and that's with good reason. They're playing the long game. They are terrible. I can't see the, you know, the thing to be excited for, to be honest. I do like Ace Bailey. I think that was a very easy pick to make. So easy that Danny Ainge couldn't screw it up, and that's right. I think or I think it still was Ainge. 'Cause I know Austin, I think is his name, his son is the Nepo guy now, but you know, Danny Ainge, super overrated, made that one, no brainer move, and people thought he was the GOAT for it, where he traded, 64-year-old Paul Pierce and 87-year-old Kevin Garnett for, a bunch of picks. Great, great job there, trade for Garnett and Allen as well, at discounts for, a championship team to be formed. Amazing. No one in the league could do something like that aside from Ainge at his best. So, definitely living off reputation. Bit negative on the Jazz, but that's just because I think they have, nothing really going for them. And, you know, there's been a lot of overly given flowers to Ainge in the past that I want to detract from because it is, in fact, overly given. So, with that said, we do have, a hot start to the East, which who would have thought that's a thing? But it is. The Cavs, definitely the highest end of East contenders this season. I'm putting them in finals or bust. I do think they're not as good, honestly, as Houston or, obviously Denver. I think their angle is just that, you know, it's a lot easier to get out of the East than it is to get out of the West. So that, does skew things a bit for them. But team wise, there's a lot to like. Mitchell can definitely go blow for blow with the league's best. I do think Lonzo, hopefully he stays healthy. And if he does, he can be a great contributor. Hunter, really solid glue guy. Mobley and Allen, great bigs. You have Garland as another good guard. I think it's very nerve wracking to have Mitchell and Garland as two big time contributors because there's just no height in that backcourt that could be, easily abused then. But their high end is certainly very high. And again, the East, I think that, makes things so much easier once again. I don't want to beat a dead horse there, but I I don't know. I think they're really close with Houston, and I actually kind of wavered on if I should actually put them ahead, but I think Houston just has a little bit better of solid foundation surrounding Durant than the Cavs do with Mitchell, even with them having high end, support. I think Houston just has a lot more of easy ways to win with, stifling opponents' offenses. And, maybe they do get a small trade in there to get like a better ball handler. But, you know, Houston and Cleveland to me right there with each other in caliber of teams. I'm gonna put Cleveland ahead of Houston. I do think again it's super close, as evident by me wavering on it so much. I do think with them in the East and just with their team right now, there's a little bit more of a rhyme or reason to things, whereas Houston is a little bit, I think, in flux with that guard situation being up in the air. Cleveland really like a lot of their team. They just kind of need to play at their potential for once come playoff time. Boston, I hate to see them in this state. I'm going to put them in as loiterers. I do think, you know, this year is just kind of getting a sense of what you can make of, the upcoming one. Unfortunately, with that Tatum injury, I don't think they're going to be bad, which is kind of a curse. You would ideally be really bad, get, number one pick type of deal, and then have Tatum and then just be smooth sailing. But that doesn't really, happen. You can't just turn the switch off and then on. So, that's fine in its way. I think Brown is really miscast as a number one. I do think he's a very solid number two, but just can't be the number one with, ball handling not really being his thing. So I do think, they're super evidently missing Tatum. I think Tatum is, like the easiest guy in the league to work with, but also, with that said, he does fill in a lot of gaps with, he can be the high end scorer that I don't think Brown can quite be. He's amazing defensively, so he improves that identity. He can play make some, so not having the strongest of playmaking options aside from him becomes less of a thing. Between White and Tatum, you have more than enough to have a functional offense, especially as like an isolation team, which they tend to be. So I hate seeing them in that loiterer tier. They should definitely be in the finals or bust one, but you know, Tatum's hurt, so that's the world we live in. A team that benefits from that for sure is the Knicks, who I think I'm a little bit higher on than the consensus. I know Cleveland is pretty favored as the East representative by a lot of people, and I believe like betting sites, but I'm more of a Knicks guy. I do think it's not just, they went further in the playoffs and, that's enough for me. I think just pound for pound, they got the better team. I love their, high end stuff with Brunson and Towns as offensive guys. Horrible defensively with those being your two, but OG, amazing defender, can shut down number ones. Even Bridges can slow down some guys. Hart gives you a lot of, valuable things, even if he's not too consistent of an offensive guy. There's, still some worries with the bench unit. I do think McBride's a solid contributor. I think Robinson, very high end contributor off the bench as well. Yabusele, I think, does supply some value. Clarkson, I think, a little overrated in that he, scores a lot, but he doesn't do it at all efficiently off the bench. So, you know, at least he does give you some sort of baseline, though, that, the offense won't totally dry up when they get some more bench action. I do think this team is a lot better of a playoff team than a regular season team. I do think with Brown being their coach, I think it's Mike Brown. Don't know why I'm struggling with that. Should know he was pretty notable coach with the Kings and has been, definitely in the league for a bit now. But either way, I think he's a very solid option. I think he can, keep the defensive intensity at a high level like they had with Tibbs, but actually give you some form of offense beyond just, hey, Brunson, score, or hey, Towns, can you score for me? So I think they're very much in the mix for a title. I don't, think they're quite up there with Denver or OKC, but in the East, you don't have to be to get there. And once you get there, it's really, really up in the air. If you can, get Brunson and Towns to play at the level they should, that's really, competitive with even the Thunder or Nuggets or whoever. So I have the Knicks, I think, honestly, a little bit above the Cavs. Not so much that it's like glaring, but enough that I do feel confident in them above them. Indiana, another terrible sight to see with Halliburton, unfortunately. And, they're also just kind of going to get some intel, I think, for moving forward. I think a lot of, their stuff is still going to be what it was. Nemhart is just going to be doing a lot more. So I think you're going to kind of get a lesser version of what Halliburton was giving you, but a similar type of thing. I'm going to put them in as loiterers. I think this is definitely a little bit sketchy, but I'm going to put them in behind New Orleans. I do think the performance for the Pacers will be better in the East, but I think if New Orleans hits their high end, which is not something you want to bank on, they haven't really done that. They still give you a little bit of something, whereas the Pacers, Siakam as your number one, I don't like that. I think he is a very legit number two, but I just think, this team, they're more of a well rounded, what you have situation than the Pelicans. but I think the Pelicans do offer you at least a little bit of zest where, you know, if they switched places and the Pelicans were in the East and the Pacers were in the West, I think the Pelicans would be the much better bet for, you know, some form of success. Neither team is going to be title contending, but I think the Pelicans, if they get Zion to be healthy for much of the year and play at around where you would hope he would, they have something going for them there. Whereas the Pacers, it's going to be a lot of hard fought games. You know, didn't have the greatest defense. They're going to have to rely on that a bit more with Halliburton not being there to contribute to the offense. The Bucks, they're, a team with very big range of outcomes. If, they do end up getting off to a really slow start and somebody says, hey, we'll really give you something for Giannis, does that become something? I assume that's a thing, even with the contract situation. But, I'm not 100% sure about that. But either way, there's a lot of outcomes where they're not anything, but there are some where Giannis does just get them to play at a decent level still. And, you know, that's really impressive because this team is really not good. I wanted to say it's just straight up terrible. I don't know if it's quite that level. Miles Turner does give you a solid guy to play off of Giannis. Kuzma, I think, is one of the worst starters in, you know, his time being in the league. And he's still somehow liked by some guys, like as a player. I'm not saying as a person, but, you know, super inefficient, doesn't play defense, doesn't contribute basically in any way. But he put up some points just doing it on a million shots. Kevin Porter Jr., terrible person, terrible player in my eyes. Kind of fun off the bench in that he can shot chuck, kind of Kyle Kuzma of guards in that sense, not scoring efficiently, but can score a little bit. AJ Green and Gary Trent, you like them as shooters that spot up, but these guys are just so miscast. You want those being sort of bench type of guys, or like, definitely your lowest end of starters, and they're kind of key contributors. So, with that said, they're a tough pick for me in that I don't think they're just loiterers, but making the playoffs and getting a ton of breaks, I don't think they're quite at that level either. So I'm going to put them in as the highest level loiterers. I just think, you know, Giannis gives you an amazing floor, but this ceiling is just not there because after him and Turner, it's like, should any of these guys even be starting type of conversations. So the Pistons get the sour taste out of your mouth from Milwaukee a good bit here. I like this Pistons team. I like it quite a lot. I think for them to really be in the mix, they are going to need a real, you know, legit number two with Cade. Ivy, you hope, can be that when healthy. So maybe, they get something going early, but I think they're more so a team you want to hitch your wagon to for the upcoming years. They're going to have some money coming in with Tobias being off the books soon. You have Hussar Thomas, um, or Thompson rather, um, who is the lesser talked about Thompson by so much, but is still really good. Does, you know, lots of the things that Amen does. So, there's a lot to like there. And there's, some solid center stuff with Stewart and Duran, but, you know, there's a little bit left to be desired as far as, talent around Cade is concerned. There's, that question mark with Ivy. What's he going to be following a serious injury. They lose Beasley, unfortunately, which is, I think, a really big drop for them because, you get something similar in Duncan Robinson, but it's just not at the level that Beasley was last year, not even close. So I think they are in the range of making the playoffs and getting a ton of breaks. I'm debating a little bit on where I put them in that tier because I do think they're just very asymmetrical with these teams in that I'm going to put them ahead of Dallas because I do think, Dallas is just so up in the air. But actually, I'm going to put the Spurs ahead of Dallas too because I maybe it's a vibe thing, but I just can't see Dallas hitting their stride quite like San Antonio's, baseline is. So moving things around a little bit there, I do think Detroit is the best of the bunch, particularly when you factor in the East part. Cade, so good. There's a lot to like for what they offer him as support, but I just think it's a little bit miscast. So that prevents me from putting them in as like a real title type of team. Orlando, definitely, making a very interesting move with Desmond Bain. Very arguable that it was an overpay for sure. But as for what the team looks like as a result, it's really interesting now. That's about as good of a guy for what they need as you could find. Somebody that can handle the ball, somebody that can shoot that thing. They get exactly what they needed for, Banchero to hopefully really take the next step and really usher in as a superstar, and Wagner, really great, number two type of guy as well, potentially even a number one. I don't think I would feel great about that, but some people probably could raise better arguments for it than I would just because I'm not quite there on Wagner. I am very worried about that, shooting situation where he just couldn't shoot. Jalen Suggs, amazing defender, great glue guy. So, there's a lot to like here. I do think this is an arguable one, but I'm going to put them in as a finals dark horse. I think Banchero and Wagner, if they, not even asking them to really make a huge step from where they were last year, I'm just saying, you know, round out the shooting a little bit. So, you're at least contributing when, no one other than Bane pretty much is, maybe Suggs as well. Tyus Jones gives you a bit as well there. So that's also something. It's just, you're not going to have all these guys out there at once. That would be very small because Bane is a smaller shooting guard, unfortunately. That's the one thing that would have been better if they could keep the, size as a good thing for them. But, Wagner and Banchero, I think you really have the makings there of something. I think really, really arguable between them and the Clippers, honestly, because I do think, the high end of Banchero I like more so than probably what we can get out of Leonard, but there's so much more foundation in place with the Clippers that I just feel a bit safer with them. So it's hard to, really decipher which one you're going with there. You could honestly, like, you could put them ahead of the Lakers potentially. They're in that mix. I think it's a very close cluster. So I'm very high on this Magic team. It is, a little bit of a projection with them more so than it is with anyone else. But I do think they have the makings of a great team moving forward and a really good team at the very least this year. With Miami, you of course have the Heat culture, which is a little bit obnoxious, and that, it's said to be basically everything with them, as opposed to, something nice as a little bit of a add-on. But, you know, they do play really hard. That is one thing you can always say about them. They just don't really have the talent, though, is the thing. So, you know, Hero and Bam, that's still pretty enticing as far as young cores go. Not maybe what you would have hoped for so far. Hero definitely took a step this past season, but still not really maybe even like a championship number two type of guy. Bam, you could maybe have as a number two if you really don't need him to do too much offensively since he can't be efficient there at a high volume. Great defender though. Davion Mitchell, another amazing defender. There's the makings of a good team here, but it's just not cohesive enough, I feel. You have, great defenders in Mitchell, Adebayo, where you hope can be a good foundational piece there as well. Wiggins, solid all around, but that's pretty much it for like really concrete, balanced guys. Maybe you think Bam constitutes as balanced, but I do just think that offense is not where it needs to be. So, you know, Powell, another kind of just offensive only guy. It's it's odd. They, you know, they're a team that seems structured around a superstar that they just simply don't have. So, that in the end leaves them kind of just middling. They're not, within range of getting a ton of breaks even. I do think, you do have a solid baseline with their defense. Putting them ahead of the Pelicans, I do think, you know, the high end stuff isn't there, but you got a really solid floor of, you know, ninth seed in the East type of play in mix as, your your baseline, I guess, with them. Someone that has a lot more to offer than that though is Hotlanta, as they're the darling team for a lot of people, but I think it's based in something. Young and Daniels, amazing sort of yin and yang situation. Young can't play a lick of defense. Daniels, all defense all the time. But, also offers a little bit on offense. He can do some stuff there. It's just, his thing is definitely defense. Young is going to give you a great offense pretty much single handedly. Tingus Pingus Porzingis, terrible guy, but really solid player when healthy. Those 10 games a year where he's healthy are always, a delight to watch. So, maybe the 10 games he's healthy this year are, the finals and the Eastern Conference finals. So, there's something there for sure. It's just, is it going to be what it looks like it potentially could be? I have some skepticism because I do just think there needs to be a super high level of constant defensive support for Young, as you just need total insulation for him being both small, not necessarily locked in, and also just not too fundamentally sound either. He's kind of just everything bad about a defensive player all in one, unfortunately. But, you know, Daniels mitigates that a bit. Risa Shea wasn't good defensively last year, but could be. Johnson, I think, really good player that lots of people would want, but you're hoping he can not only be healthy, but also be a little more than he's shown himself to be. Nikhil Alexander Walker, I love. I think very solid player that championship teams would love to have. I think Minnesota's unfortunate, you know, how things worked out with that one, because I think he was a really solid guy to have. Kennard, one of the best shooters in the league, that doesn't really get talked about because he just can shoot, and that's really it. But he can play make actually a little bit as well. Not the worst defender, not good, but you know something there. So Okongwu, good backup big. I like him a lot more as a backup than like you're really locking into him because he can be really good defensively, but rather undersized. So, big guys can bully him a little bit. And, with Young being undersized at the point guard position, having a five that's also undersized is just not ideal. So you're really relying on Porzingis a lot here. And, that makes things very volatile. And, you're also saying Risashe be a really good number or, really good contributor in your second year, you know, basically level up in every way. Daniels pick up where you left off last year. Johnson get back in the thick of things right away. There's a lot of, volatility with all of those things. But with that said, if this team can be, at like the solid part of their performance arc, they are really in the mix in the East. I wouldn't really think too much of them in the West, but you know, they get the right matchups in the East. I think there is some, some stuff to wonder about. So, I don't think they are quite good enough to be considered a dark horse. I also think some people are maybe a little bit overrating them because they've made good moves that are like kind of flashy as well with, Porzingis being a interesting notable name that is good but is just, never healthy unfortunately for, the teams. So, there's maybe a little bit of overrating and maybe a little bit of underrating because people think, with Young not being able to defend, he's, not actually a winning player, but he is. He just needs, some defensive support more so than a lot of guys will. So you can put them in, I think, at the bottom end of the finals dark horse. I'm instead, though, going to put them in at the high end of make the playoffs and get a ton of breaks, not just the high end, the highest of ends. I do really think they're towing that line. Again, to the Lakers, the Clippers, Orlando, they're all really close. I think Atlanta's right alongside them, just not quite there though. So Chicago, you you already know they're finishing 10th in the East, getting a play-in spot somehow, and not going to do anything with it, but you know, they're consistent. So that means something. I don't know exactly what, but you know, Kobe White, get him on a good team. He can do some stuff. Zealous, I do think, lots of smart people love him. I've grown to really like him. I think, something to watch out for in the future, but, just this year, Buzelis, Giddy, solid guys, but you're hoping are going to be more of things down the line. Giddy, showed lots of stuff towards the end of the year, but at that point, the team wasn't really in the mix for anything. Lots of teams were checked out. What's real out of that? Who's to say? You know, there's there's some stuff on this team. It's just definitely not enough to really be in the thick of things at all. I'm just questioning where, a part of the loiterers they should go. I think there's an argument for them to be pretty high up on the thing, not like, Celtics level, but, maybe you like them in line with, say, like the Pelicans. I think that is reasonable, but I think I'm just going to have to lock into right around, you know, right around the middle part of it like they always are in the East, kind of where, they're towing the line between being really bad and just regular bad. So kind of in the middle again. There, I think, Suns, I like what they have more. in lots of ways. Actually, yeah, I like it enough to put them ahead of the Bulls, so we're putting them more in the bad part than, the good part, but, you know, there's there's still something going on with this Chicago team. They, gonna have another move with Sacramento, surely. They are partners to the ends of time, it seems, just trading guys back and forth and neither getting better nor worse in the process. But, maybe they're getting better in the sense that they don't get tricked by a good team. So, that's something. Toronto, another team that is going in the loiterers spot, which is really getting jam packed. But Toronto's at least a bit interesting. I will say that. I do think they have not concerned themselves basically at all with you know a sort of coherent plan. Seems like lots of just like, let's get some guys and, let them be tall. But like beyond that, who's to say? You got Ingram, you got Barnes. Those are some good big forwards, lengthy at least for sure. Barrett's a guy in that mix. Grady Dick, a you know solid prospect of sorts. I think he entered a little bit old into the league relative to, what high end draft picks generally do. I think it was like 20, so, not old by any stretch, but, you know, seems like if you enter the draft and you're not 18 and 1 day old, it's like, oh, he's a little seasoned, grizzled vet. So, I'm not sure what the ceiling looks like there. I do think, Colin Murray Boyles, a fun, you know, addition, but not one that really makes too much sense necessarily. So seems like there's just a lot of things going on, but also like simultaneously nothing as well. You don't love the bench unit for sure. Pirtle is a good center, 100%. I'm reaching my verdict. I'm putting them in behind the Pacers. And am I putting them ahead of the Suns? I'll put them ahead of the Suns. I think it's razor thin. So, you know, I think that the records might be drastically different, but I think again, it's just kind of a conference things. We have some easy ones to round this out. Playing the long game, also playing for the love of the game. Honestly, they're, just kind of having fun. I'm putting Brooklyn. Am I putting them ahead of the Jazz? I really, really struggle with it. I'll put the Jazz ahead of Brooklyn, I guess. This this should tell you everything because I did say the Jazz suck, and Brooklyn, they're right there with them. You got Igor Demon, a a point guard that can initiate stuff. You got Cam Thomas who wants the ball in his hand and nobody else's ever, and he's gonna brick a lot of shots, make some though. Trying to get the highlight reel going. Michael Porter Jr. really odd trajectory. Was an amazing prospect, then had the back issue, then showed up as like a just kind of a spot up 3-point shooter that can't defend, so not a 3 and D guy. Very odd stuff. And Claxton, I think, getting a little bit old for a run, jump, and dunk center, but still really solid guy. I think Claxton is the guy that would most be wanted by actual teams because I don't think Brooklyn's necessarily, you know, NBA caliber. So, you know, Claxton, if he got moved, which I think probably should happen just because, again, his timeline's not exactly where the timeline of like Demon and the 28 other first round picks they made this year is. So, you know, at that point, just try to get as young as you can, I guess. Not a lot to say there. A lot to say, though, here with Philly. That is a fun transition because, my goodness, this team surely has the widest range of outcomes in the entire league, even more so than the Mavs, I would say. Them on their high end are the East Finals representative. That's like, the real high end, of course, but that's the level they can be. Them on the low end, it's like, 20 wins. It is absurd what they have going on. And, it's just anytime you have a two timeline situation where you got, win now guys at the end of the prime and Embiid and guys that are going to get better with time, like Maxi and McCain and Edgecombe now too. You know, you have some weird stuff brewing, but the 76ers are just that to the absolute highest extent. They they just completely confuse me. I can't say it any bit beyond that because Embiid and Maxi, I do really like as a potential big man, little guy situation. Paul George, not, you know, not too great of a number three, unfortunately. I thought the contract was fine, but just, not too much of anything. He's just basically what we've known Paul George to be, but at like 80% instead of, like maybe 90% like they would have hoped for. And, Embiid, it really is talked about ad nauseum, but you don't know if you're getting, you know, 30 games from him or not. So hard to get a read on. I do think they are exactly what the make the playoffs, get a ton of breaks. Um, what that tier was intended to be. I'm just questioning the placement a little bit because, you know, what is their average outcome? I have no idea. It their average outcome might be like 30 wins. But, again, there is the real chance that somehow they do get healthy and somehow they go on a run. So, you know, what do you call that? I think to be fair, I'm gonna put them ahead of the Warriors, like I did with the Mavs, even with them, being so volatile. But I do think the Mavs go higher just because I do think, you know, they're a similar situation, but not quite as high of a ceiling, probably in like a reasonable way. Because if Irving's healthy and, everyone's healthy, then Mavs are, better than the 76ers, but I don't think you can really expect that. You can't expect too much that Embiid and others are going to be healthy either for the 76ers, but the Irving thing I think is the most up in the air out of all of those, even coming back from a serious injury. The 76ers, though, you know, really enticing high end in a weak conference, but the Mavs have a foundation at least. So, you know, Golden State, I think their median outcome, their average outcome, what have you, higher than the 76ers. But as far as get a ton of breaks go and, something interesting can happen, I think the 76ers better encapsulate that. So I'm putting them ahead of Golden State, even with Golden State, having a much higher baseline. Charlotte, we're rounding this thing out sad. They're they're playing the long game, honestly. Definitely better than the Jazz and the Nets. LaMelo's, you know, occasionally a good player. He can, you know, give you 30 on 50 shots. He can give you 30 on, 20 shots. It's hard to say. So, you know, that and Miller is something interesting for the future. I don't think it's in any way good for the future, unfortunately for them. But, kind of fortunately because Miles Bridges is a terrible person. So, you do like seeing them not be good in that sense if you have any sort of ethics. And a team, though, that is terrible and not, rooting against them. Maybe there's something bad about them that I don't know about. They did have Porzingis. Not sure when his incident happened in relation to when they did, but either way, right now, nobody, that I'm rooting against on this team, but kind of wish I was because this team is just so jank. You know, you got McCollum and Middleton, solid vets, even as they're very aged at this point. And then everybody else, it's like their second year in the league. Even Bagley, it's like he's been in the league for a while now, but it's like, you know, he's still learning basketball. So, you know, this team is not going to be good in under any circumstances, but they could be, better than some of these teams that are ahead of them. Not what I was intending to do. I'm putting them behind Charlotte. I think, you know, Washington does give you a little bit of an upside. I definitely like Lowry Markkinen more than what the Wizards have to offer for their lead guy, but I think Washington, they have something interesting at basically every turn. Bub Carrington, not an efficient scorer, but can score a little bit. Blau Kolobali, I believe. Analytics darling. I don't know if he's actually an analytics darling. I haven't really looked too deeply into his numbers. They weren't impressive to me in the initial looking that I did, but a lot of people that are super smart like him, so I consider him in that realm. Corey Kispert may be the worst defender in the league in that sort of vein, but can shoot the three, so that's fun. They have something on the bench. The bench is about as good as the starters, which, in the case of like the Clippers, that's exciting where the bench can hang with the starters. But in the case with the Wizards, it's the sad part of that where the bench is as good as the starters because the starters suck. Cam Whitmore, lots of people like him. I don't, but you know, there's there's some stuff to look at. Would be remiss if I didn't mention Sar. I think Sar is maybe in that like Triple J type of realm of a player that's a little bit more finesse than, the rugged stuff you would like to see for a big guy, but he can be very intriguing moving forward as a super talented player. So there's some stuff to like for Washington. You hope they're heading in the right direction with all these young guys, but right now it's probably going to be rough. Just to show you again, this is what the whole tier looks like. Be sure to let me know where exactly I went most wrong, where I went, just a little bit wrong, etc., etc. And thank you for watching. Be sure to be kind to yourself, treat yourself like you would a friend, and thank you for watching.